Just forward.
Cool. Kia ora everyone, thanks for having me today. Unfortunately, my colleague Justin, who's our actual policy lead on this review, couldn't make it today. He's based in Christchurch, so if you have any technical questions, please feel free to send them through to Glenn and the team, and we'll get back to you on those. Okay, so today I'm here to talk through the occupational regulation reforms to the engineers. Okay, just a brief summary. The building policy team at MBIE is responsible for 6 occupational regulation regimes in the building construction sector, including engineers, currently engineering associates, architects, licensed building practitioners, plumbers, gasfitters, drainlayers, and electrical workers. So the purpose of occupational regulation is to protect the public from harm that's caused by negligent, reckless, or incompetent practice. There's usually a high bar before the government will get involved in occupational regulation. So there has to be a significant risk to public harm, health and safety, and usually occupational regulation involves some form of barriers to entry, and there's a regulator that's involved in sanctioning poor performance. And there are usually professional standards or code of ethics within the regime. And let's see. So currently, the engineering regime is a voluntary system, and there's been quite a few several consultations that have been taking place. And this has gone all the way back to the Christchurch earthquakes with the collapse of the CTV building and the Royal Commission that followed, which found that the current regime isn't fit for purpose. So a lot of the risk stems from the inability to hold engineers to account currently. There's estimated 38,000 engineers who aren't subject to any form of regulation currently. So there's no way to hold these people to account under the voluntary regime if they're not registered as a CPEng. And currently the governance regimes are also not as good as they could be. Engineering New Zealand currently administers the CPEng regime, but there are also some potential conflicts there as a member organisation, or who also administers and enforces some of those provisions. And so there were 3 rounds of public consultation going all the way back to, I think, 2013 on the reforms. And last year, the public consultation on the current form of the regime received over 250 submissions. And we found that 84% of people were supportive of government intervention in the engineers regime and supportive of a mandatory regime. So I can just talk through a bit about what the new regime would look like. So it's intended to be a 2-tier regime with mandatory registration and licensing of high-risk areas. So we're currently working through the drafting of the legislation with the Parliamentary Council Office. So there's a few details here that will need to be worked out as we develop the legislation. Presently, it's proposed that any person who provides professional engineering services will need to be registered. So the eligibility requirements are intended to be set by the new board for rules and regulations, and we expect this will include an appropriate qualification and recognition of alternative pathways for those who don't meet the traditional qualification path. And we are looking at some overseas models as a basis for designing the new regime. This includes the New South Wales changes that came in recently, as well as a Canadian example from Ontario. And the new board will also have guidance and ability to provide guidance for registration, who should be registered. But generally the regime is intended to be quite wide to capture a range of engineering disciplines. And the other part of this regime will be the engineering associates scheme. So it's proposed that the current act will be repealed and the registered engineering associates regime will be part of the new regime with a separate register. And there'll be a pathway for registration for these groups as well as licensing. Okay, so I know you will be interested in how engineers currently regulated by other regimes may be captured by this new regime. So we're aware of the Maritime Transport Act, the Civil Aviation Act, which will cover aircraft maintenance engineers and marine engineers, electricians. So our aim here is to avoid any regulatory overlap and avoid unnecessary duplication in costs. I think the intention is that engineers should still be subject to the same professional standards as their colleagues, and many specialist regimes already restrict entry and have some disciplinary processes. And we understand there is a fit and proper test for some of these other regimes. So therefore, the regime will include a mechanism to exempt certain persons and services from a requirement to be registered where appropriate. That means they won't have the ability, though, to use a protected title or be subject to any of the conditions of registration. However, the proposal will also include a regulatory power that the board can automatically register those engineers into the regime. It's almost like a deeming model that we have under the licensed building practitioners regime. So this will be determined by the new regulatory board. On the topic of overseas engineers, we recognise that engineering is global activity, and this has been raised by submitters on this consultation. So it's proposed that there will be a temporary registration class. It is intended not to be more than 3 months at this stage, but the board will determine the eligibility requirements for the rules. And the intention is that overseas engineers can be supervised by New Zealand registered engineers, but some specialist areas will have to be determined whether that's appropriate or not. Okay, so the second tier of the regime is the licensing. So the intention is that licensing will be restricted to work in high-risk practice areas. So this isn't currently defined, but while there are some examples in the cabinet paper referring to structural, fire, geotech, and recreational safety, they're not intended to be the be-all at this stage. These are just examples, and the regulations that come under the new legislation will further define which areas of practice will be covered. And as part of this, there will be a consultation process, and this will be set in the regime, so there will be mandatory consultation before any regulations are made, so we invite you to provide your submissions once the time comes to develop the regulations under that area. And the intention is that the regulations will be determined off the need to demonstrate competency, and the idea is to have a flexible regime that can adapt to the changing nature of engineering, and the list could evolve over time. At this stage, it's proposed that the license will be valid for 6 years, which would give the board the ability to reassess competence at the time of reapplication. And it would be an offence to carry out or supervise restricted services without a license. Some alternatives were considered during the consultation, including an endorsement to act as a licensed class, but key stakeholders did not support these proposals, and given the issues with the current voluntary regime, it was determined that licensing for high-risk areas would be an appropriate path. Okay, and the next aspect of the regime is the complaints and discipline. So a robust complaints regime is critical for ensuring engineers are held to account for poor practice or performance, and that public has confidence in the profession. So we're looking at a similar model across the other regulatory regimes for the building and construction sector. It's intended the board would have the power to suspend or place conditions on an engineer's registration or license, pending the outcome of an investigation if it's in the public interest. Also, the board would have the ability to consider complaints and take disciplinary action, and that action would be enforceable even if a person is no longer registered or licensed. And finally, a new regulator will be required for the regime. So the current governance arrangements were deemed to lack the accountability and transparency and independence that we would require of an occupational regulator. So the new board is intended to be accountable to the minister, and MB would monitor the board on behalf and provide administrative support So this is a model that's already in place for other regimes, including electrical workers, licensed building practitioners, and I think that is and the plumbers, gas fitters, and drainlayers. So the new regulator will be a statutory independent board supported by other bodies. So the intention is to provide a balance of leadership that's independent, accountability to the government, and input from the profession to promote confidence in registered and licensed people in public safety. Okay, the next slide sets out how the regimes currently work together within the new regime and how they work together. So at the top left, you have the Minister for Building and Construction, who appoints the relevant board and would approve the rules and regulations. And then you'd have an ordering council, which is a regulatory process which sets up the rules and processes. And the board then oversees the performance of others performing the functions in this regime and sets the rules for eligibility for registration and licensing, and also establishes the disciplinary committee. I can send around these slides later as the writing's a bit small on those. And the model is intended to be flexible, and this is the default model that operates in the occupational regulation regime. But regulations can be made to assign some of those roles elsewhere if appropriate. And many of these provisions are based on the existing Crown Entities Act for how boards are appointed and governed. So in terms of transitional arrangements, the bill will contain the appropriate provisions for this. So this would likely include the expiry of the current CPN's regime. Engineering New Zealand will continue to act as a registration authority in the meantime, and complaints will continue to be heard for historic work. And there will be deeming provisions for engineers that satisfy the eligibility requirements. And the transitional period is expected to last for approximately 6 years from the time that the new legislation is passed. This allows time to get the new board appointed, up and running, and the new registration processes set up, and supporting regulations and registering and licensing engineers before the regime comes into force. In terms of timing, the bill is still being drafted by the Parliamentary Council Office, so it's expected that it's not going to be introduced to Parliament until sometime in the second quarter of 2023. The intention is that we're doing our best to ensure the bill can get into Parliament before the election and refer to Select Committee. At that stage, you'll have the opportunity to make further submissions through the Select Committee process. And then in 2024, we expect the bill to be enacted, and that will kick off the processes for board appointments and supporting rules and regulations for eligibility and licensing to be developed. And then that kicks off the transitional period before the regime actually comes into place, which we expect is 2030 at this stage. Okay, and we've just included a slide on the legislative processes for those who are interested in how a bill makes its way through Parliament before it's enacted in law. So there'll be an opportunity to make a submission at Select Committee, and there are opportunities to speak publicly to your submissions as well, in addition to written submissions at that stage. So yeah, now we have time for some general high-level questions, but if you have some more technical or more detailed questions, I can refer you to my colleagues in writing. Cool. Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
I think I just wanted to make a comment. This is a special group of engineers here. They're all delegation holders of the Director of Civil Aviation. So you may want to make sure that the laws that you're putting before Parliament will pass this test. If you can make this the Director of Civil Aviation comply with that law, then we will comply with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there will be regulations made to take into account the existing regulatory regimes and the other legislation. Thank you. Sorry, was there a question there first?
If they define what protected term is going to be, is it going to be engineered, or is it a derivative that's still being defined? Because I remember the initial consultation, you had, automotive engineer, all this sort of thing, and that covers the wide range, whereas, for those who probably know, a protected term architect is specifically, we just would be defined. So that was just a question, can they define what the protected term will be, or is it still to be?
Yeah, so we're still working through the definition of engineer in the legislation, but at this stage it's intended that it will be similar to the architect's regime that's broadly applied, so that if you're an engineer you would be registered under the regime, and then if you're a high risk area then that would go into the licensing. So I think currently the Parliamentary Council Office is still working through the definition of how to define someone who provides engineers, someone who provides professional engineering services, but we're looking at the overseas models, and I think there's a reference to engineering principles and application of those in the work as the basis for the regime. So, but will be further consultation on that, I expect, once the bill is drafted and gets into the select committee stage. Oh, great. So question there?
I kind of missed it at the beginning, but what's the purpose of this to improve safety?
Yeah, so I can go back to the start. Yeah, so basically the Royal Commission of Inquiry from the Christchurch earthquakes found that in the CTV building collapse, there wasn't sufficient accountability to hold the engineers responsible for the failures in that situation. So given the voluntary regime, there's, I think, quite a few regulatory gaps in the regime that we're looking to address. So, a core part of occupational regulation is to protect the public from risk to life and health and safety. So that is a key fundamental part.
Why are they taking so long?
Yeah.
So, what safety concern we can take 12 years ago?
Yeah, I think policy generally works very slowly, and just given I think some of the policy proposals before that were consulted on, I think the views have changed on that. I think initially they had looked at a certification and registration regime, not a mandatory one, but it was, I think, eventually after the 3 rounds of public consultation, it was determined that mandatory registration licensing was the most appropriate given the risk to public harm there. So we are trying to move as quickly as we can, but there are other government priorities for legislation, which unfortunately are out of our control. But that is, we're definitely trying to get the regime in place as soon as we can. Cool. Yes?
Thank you for the presentation, Yoni. You stated midway through that the Minister needs to consult with the relevant recognised professional bodies. And I just wanted to double check that was broader than just Engineering New Zealand. The example that I'm thinking of specifically is the Royal Aeronautical Society and the New Zealand division.
So I think there will be a general requirement to consult on people who are affected by the proposals. So it will definitely be broader than the Engineering New Zealand group. I think the current regulations aren't defined yet, but I'll definitely make sure that we capture these groups that are wider than that. Great. Yes?
You mentioned on your slide yourself a recognition of existing systems. Do you think in the case of those of us who hold a delegation, a form of license from CAA, is the proposal more to be incorporation into the system by recognition or exemption from the system? Or is that not yet decided?
I think the intention for this, the details are still being worked through, but is that if there is an existing licensing process and a fit and proper equivalent test, then that could be appropriate for automatic recognition. But for those other regimes who don't have the code of ethics or the fit and proper testing, they would require some sort of registration that is separate to the current process. But I'll be definitely keen to hear your views on how that might work in practice.
The There was another bullet point you didn't speak to, but is very close to us. You said bullet point, some consultancies may choose to only license senior staff. I think I saw that on the slide. In the middle of that screen, the practice consultancies may choose to license senior staff. That is similar to how we operate.
Okay.
The people in this room are typically people of a certain seniority in an aircraft design organisation who then go for the delegation. So it'd be interesting to see at what point this steps in for all of our staff. Do we ask our junior engineers to become registered and then later they become licensed, perhaps by getting a delegation as they do today?
That is definitely something to be worked through as we design the regime and regulations. I think there will probably be something set out in the rules or regulations that may set out a threshold or define the level of risk that might require the licensing to kick in. So that's still to be worked out. But let's definitely take your point there. Okay,
What's the rationale for licensing individuals rather than companies or businesses or organisations? So we operate in the organisation is licensed and then there are people within those. That's sort of generally the aviation sort of going more towards organisation approval rather than individuals.
So basically, I think this was developed in the consultation paper, but I think in terms of best practice occupational regulation, it is focused on the practitioners and holding individuals to account who are doing the work. And I think there are been some issues in the past with, I think, licensing the companies and not having adequate supervision, because we have to ensure that there are adequate supervision within the company processes and there's less oversight from the regulatory board of those individuals in the alternative context. So that's where they landed with the policy decisions there.
So in our industry generally, and that certainly people here will understand this, the dealings in other parts of the engineering is that our industry is extremely good in most cases at having peer review of the work in a process of multiple people reviewing before something gets approved or built. And in the case you mentioned that drove this, the Christchurch one was kind of an industry and maybe a failing in some cases of a lack of review and individuals acting independently. What's being proposed is a system that addresses kind of at the end of the process when something goes wrong and you're looking for accountability. Would it not be better to adopt some learnings from our industry and others to bring in the peer review and requirements in front of the process if that's the goal?
Yep, that's a really good point. I think part of the regulatory regime is that there would be ongoing continuing professional requirements similar to other occupational regimes, and they'll be set by the regulatory board at the time. So I think at the time of registration and also when the renewal comes up, there's that point, that check and balance there, and to follow that ongoing CPD requirements before you can continue to be registered. So that's, I think, one of the ways that we're looking to improve that accountability during the holding of the license and registration, not just at the end with the complaints and discipline processes. But we'd be interested in hearing your thoughts on how that peer review process might work in the context of a regulatory regime and how that could be built into the regime, if you have any further thoughts to share on that. Right. Yes?
If New Zealand government is a licensed engineer and an accident happens and people killed, who's got responsibility for defending that engineer in court and any liability?
Okay. So I might not have the technical detail in front of me, but I understand that it is a criminal offence if there is that breach that happens there. So I would assume that it's like the personal practitioner that's licensed, the engineer that would be licensed, that would be held accountable. But I'll talk to my colleagues about how that regime is intended to work, and we can come back to you on how that design of the regime works. So, yes.
Yeah, what do you believe are the benefits for our industry?
Benefits. So I think it's going back to the, I guess, occupational regulation. What I believe. Oh, yeah. So I just follow the policy process. So there's actually a cabinet circular from 1999 which sets out the good regulatory practice for occupational regulation. So basically that's our framework for how we think about regulating occupations. And so for something to actually come in under occupational regulation, there needs to be a significant risk to public harm, risk to life and safety. So that's the bar, that starting position that we start from. And with engineers, definitely we see there, just given the Royal Commission and previous consultation, has found this is definitely a regulation that is appropriate for occupational regulation.
That's a very broad brush across all engineers.
Yeah.
So I'd like to talk specifically about what we do. You provide certification engineers, provide public design organisations. Is there anything in there that sort of specifically will benefit us and use oversight regulation?
Yep, I guess so in terms of like maintaining professionalism of the standard and ensuring that there's public confidence in the profession, that's a big part of occupational regulation, and also reduce the risk to public safety if things go wrong, that there are accountability mechanisms that to prevent the kind of minority of people who don't follow the codes of ethics or the poor performance. So there's measures to take accountability against people who don't perform to the standards you would expect of a professional engineer. Yep.
Does that not imply then that you need to regulate both the processes for engineering design as well as the individual? It's all very well accusing an individual of failing to do a proper job, but unless that job is specified in sufficient detail to assure that the checks and balances are present, then you really don't have any grounds for prosecution. Like in our industry, it is set out clearly that there shall be independent checks of certain things. But if there were an industry, and apparently there is, where such a thing was not specified in any regulation, you're relying on the judgment of the individual. Then it becomes a nebulous point or a point of law that you have to argue on a case basis, which is the failing in the first place. If the process of checking was set out as it is in our industry, then you could hold somebody accountable for not following that specification. You don't have to get into detail about building the set of drawings will be checked, but there needs to be some kind of high-level theory that sets out there shall be some independent checking and there shall be expertise and authorisation of individuals and so on. And I don't hear that in any of this presentation, which we're focusing purely on the individual and that individual's capability, willingness and commitment to following what is best practice. But if best practice is not defined, you've committed to a piece of vacuum.
Yep, that's a really good point. I think in terms of the standards, the regime will set out the standards for professionalism, so the codes of ethics and how people should be behaving, but in terms of the technical expertise, so I don't think I think the government isn't best placed to determine like what an expert process should look like, but and that will be up to the board, the regulatory board at the time, to set out the eligibility rules and the processes and the actual standards and rules that will be followed. So the government here is just setting the legislative framework under which the regime will operate under, and then it's a matter of seeking feedback from the experts like yourselves to design what those processes and rules will look like under that. But I'd be keen to hear your feedback on how you think that might work in practice. So if you would like to send us an email about that, we can pass on that feedback. Was there one more time? Yeah.
I don't have a question, but I have a comment to Rob as well. I don't think licensing or registration removes the culpability of the employer in any incident. For example, accrue from. It doesn't mean the PhD is not a contributing party. So that's known in New Zealand that we might launch an investigation, and on the basis of that investigation, they might submit document or training, or ultimately look at the ability to work with one. But that process is separate. This is actually.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Thanks for your comment there. Cool. So I think that's all the time we have. But yes, feel free to, we'll send through the slides and then please email through your remaining questions and we'll try to get through those. Cool. Thanks. Thank you.